Hey guys, welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today's review of Frankie Boyle's 2012 special Last Days of Sodom was chosen by patron Brad Oldfield, so thank you Brad. If you'd like to know how you can choose a review, then keep listening and let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. As a special limited time offer, anyone who becomes a patron during the month of July, regardless of which tier, can choose one stand-up special that will be reviewed on the podcast, as well as receiving the standard benefits for the tier you choose. This offer runs out on the 31st of July, so head on over to patreon.com/standupreview for this one-time deal. We'll start off with some background. Frankie Boyle is well known in the UK, most notably for his recurring role on Mock the Week. That show is one of the reasons I really got into comedy, and I've been a fan of Frankie's pretty much since then. This is his third stand-up special and was kind of billed as his farewell, if I remember correctly. It's certainly the last thing I've seen of his, and I had seen all of his shows up to and including this one. But it turns out he has released more comedy since then and was touring last year, so I will be doing more reviews of his. In terms of his comedic style, they're very short, quick-fire jokes, and Frankie is the definition of dark humour, definitely not for the easily offended. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. At the open of the show, Frankie jumps straight into abusing the audience, which, if you know anything about him, that's pretty much standard business. He talks to the audience for a bit with some really dark jokes, and he takes no time easing you into the show at all. He then goes through a few random jokes, they're very quick fire, and he's just getting into the rhythm of the show at this point. The first sort of major bit is about children, and well, he doesn't really tell stories or discuss a topic, but will sort of group a load of jokes together in a similar area. So when I say a bit, it's more just jokes around a similar subject. He then goes on to talk about suicide, and there are some really good jokes in this bit. There's not going to be a lot to say for this, unfortunately. Frankie's brilliant, and a lot of his jokes are told in a very similar way. It's just very quick fire, very one-liner type comedy. He goes on to talk about daytime TV, and he kind of makes a point about cancel culture here, before cancel culture was even really a thing. He also in this bit makes a joke about Shannon Matthews, who, if you don't know who she is, Google it. It doesn't really matter. She was kidnapped. But when the audience is slightly shocked by the joke, he makes a point of saying that that was nothing and it's going to get a lot worse later in the show, which really his audiences should expect at this point. He has a few brilliant jokes on football or soccer for any Americans. And then he talks to the audience a bit more again, and he doesn't really interact with the audience. It's much more just making jokes at their expense. But it's a good way of showing that he can come up with jokes on the fly and everything's not just pre-written. He does talk to a couple of audience members, and he doesn't really make jokes. It's funny, but he's more just talking to them and making some funny points. In the next part of the show, he talks about the Olympics, and there are some really good jokes. And one thing he does well that can be quite hard with that style of comedy, the sort of one-liner stuff, is he doesn't really stay on one topic for too long. He will have 2 or 3 jokes and then move on. But for example, in this bit, he's talking about the Olympics, but will jump around different sports. And obviously it helps with that specific example of the Olympics. And the jokes are all funny anyway, so if he had enough funny jokes within one certain part of that, he probably could go on for a bit longer. But with one-liners, it can be hard to stay on one topic for too long. Frankie then talks about dark comedy as sort of an art form, and he makes a serious point here, probably as serious as I've ever seen Frankie get within the context of a comedy show. And it's not too long, he does quickly get back to telling jokes, but he does a really good job of talking about dark humour, and when someone like Frankie Boyle takes time out of his special to make a point, it kind of makes it stand out more, because he is usually so focused on, this is a comedy show, there's no serious points to be made, it's just to make you laugh. And although some of the comedians are a lot more direct and do talk about serious things more often, and that's fine, a lot of them do it really well, and there is a place for that in comedy, but it just stands out more when someone is trying to make a point who wouldn't usually do so. It's quite interesting to see, and like I said, he does it very well, and the few jokes he makes within this bit are still really good. Afterwards, he talks about the Leveson inquiry, and he goes through some celebrity impressions, and they're kind of done in a way where it's obviously not serious impressions, but they're a little bit of a shit impression, but that's kind of also the point. He's not an impressionist. And within this bit, just as it's about to start dragging, he calls himself out on it, sort of saying, what the fuck am I doing? And it's just about perfectly timed and a really good example of dragging a bit out purposefully, which when it's done wrong is horrific, but when it's done right and the person just calls themselves out at the right time, I love it personally. There's something to comedy where you know you're dragging it out and you're trying to make the audience wonder what you're doing and then calling that out. Anyway. There's then another group of sort of random jokes. They're all really good, but there's not really a specific topic. And then he talks to the audience again, and the audience knows that they're only there for him to take the piss out of. And it's similar to how Jimmy Carr does audience interaction. It's just that Frankie Boyle is a lot harsher and the audience has a lot less of a say in it. He's not really getting them involved for him to interact off. He's just getting them to introduce themselves and then telling a load of jokes at their expense, which I would argue is a little bit harder to do in terms of building an audience, because at least if the audience member's involved in it, then they know they're expecting it back. But as I said, this is at a point in his career where he's well established for doing this anyway. He goes on to talk about his son, and there's a few fairly tame jokes within this bit. I don't know if he just wanted to mention his son in a special, or if, I mean, they're still good jokes, so not everything has to be that full dark humour that we come to expect from Frankie. And he does turn it up and get to that eventually. But I think it's interesting that he puts some tamer jokes in and doesn't feel the need to put those tamer jokes towards the start of the special. A lot of comedians would try to ease the audience into the darker stuff, so I appreciate that he puts them in the middle rather than at the start. In the next bit, he talks about Michael Jackson, and he kind of comes up with a lot of really creative ways for Michael Jackson to abuse kids, which is really great. The jokes, obviously, not the thought of that. But he then goes on to tell a fairly pointless story that's not even particularly funny. He does point out that it's hard to move on from the Michael Jackson bit, but it's just really not needed, and I feel like he could have very easily just gone from that bit to the next bit without any real problem. But I hadn't spent time touring with the show, so who knows. He then tells some jokes about Glasgow, and there are some references that people who don't know about Glasgow's politics won't understand. I won't pretend to completely understand all of them, but the ones that I do get are great. And I like when comedians don't worry about who's going to understand a joke. They'd rather try to be funny than not tell a joke because not everyone will get it. That integrity of, I'm going to tell a joke, I'm in Glasgow, so this audience should get it. I think it's filmed in Glasgow, I'm not sure. It's in Scotland. I'd much rather that than worry about, oh, what if someone who is from America and doesn't understand Glasgow politics? Just be funny, and if people get it, they get it. The rest of the show is good enough to piggyback off that bit. Afterwards, he talks about sex, and there are a few different subjects here, and a few more tame jokes, at least by his standards. And like I said before, I like that he doesn't open with those and he fits them in the middle here, or I guess just kind of puts them in wherever they fit into the show. And I mean, let's face it, you're either going to like Frankie or you're not. There's no point in him trying to sugarcoat the first 2 minutes of the show. He goes on to talk to the audience again, and this time he actually finds out what they do, and it's more of a standard audience participation bit. Obviously, he's still taking the piss, and it's still dark humour, but it's more of the usual what you would expect than the previous ones, and it still works really well. He talks about disability a little bit, and he makes a semi-serious point, but doesn't really stop telling jokes at any point. He just kind of hints at the point. I feel like I said point a bit too much there. He talks about politics. This is kind of a 50-50 bit. Certain jokes just don't really land for me. I don't know if I just wasn't aware enough of the political landscape at the time, but I just didn't find parts funny, and this bit went on a little bit too long in my opinion. It definitely wasn't bad, I'd just rather it as a minute or so shorter. This blends in quite well to him talking about Scotland, and he makes quite a serious point here. There aren't quite as many jokes as I would like. He keeps it funny and he breaks it up well enough, but if I had to say anything negative about the show, it would be this last kind of couple of bits. Afterwards, he jumps around a few different topics again, and they're all really great jokes. And this leads you into the ending, and here he makes a few jokes about a child trafficking group. In my opinion, it's quite a weak end to the show. I expect more from Frankie. It's definitely not a bad way to end the show, and it's only weak compared to the rest of the show. But he sort of says that after talking about that, there's not really anywhere to go with the show, and I think someone of Frankie's caliber could get more out of that subject matter. And as I said, it's not bad, I just think he could have ended the show a lot better. So a few extra things. There are only 2 or 3 callbacks, but they're all used really well and feel natural within the show. There's not really any place for transitions within this style of comedy. A couple of times he does transition well, but he never tries to force it, and with one-liners, it makes sense to just jump from one topic to the next. In terms of his stage persona, Frankie's is pretty much just that he doesn't care about anything and he'll just say the worst thing that comes to his head. One thing I do like is that he opens up straight away with that style of comedy, so there's no doubt about what you're getting. By this point in his career, Frankie was already well established for this style of comedy, but there's no point in him trying to pretend it's anything that it's not. If people are going to be offended, they're going to be offended very early on. As for the audience, well, they know what they're expecting when they see Frankie Boyle. He's well established in the UK. Anytime he interacts with the audience, it goes down really well, and Frank and the audience are able to bounce off each other well. I'm kind of interested to look into some of his earlier shows to see what the audience is like before he's as well established as he is. But by this point, he's very much built an audience for himself. So now, some overall thoughts. There are a lot of topical jokes throughout the show, which kind of means you have to remember what was happening at the time. But the jokes themselves are funny, which really helps. Other than that, Frankie is great. I'm a huge fan of his, and this special is some of his best work in my opinion. If you're a fan of dark humour, or you think you are, I'd suggest you watch this to find out if you really are a fan of dark humour, because Frankie Boyle is one of those comedians who will just take what you think dark humour is to the next level. As for a rating, there's not really a lot to say. It's a great show, but I just don't think it quite hits that top tier for me, so I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at Stand Up Review and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day, and we'll see you for the next episode. This podcast is made possible by our patron, Brad Oldfield. If you would also like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support.